It's going to take about 10 seconds to go live. I see it doing something on my multiple screens. We are now LinkedIn Live. Hey, hi, everyone. This is Lou Adler on the Almost Daily Recruiting Show. Delighted to have you with us today. We're going to actually do some quite interesting stuff. We're actually going to break some myths, blow up some HR excuses of what's the legal side of hiring. So we're going to get into some with my probably the world's expert. Well, sorry, Dave, you're now the world's expert on hiring diverse talent and all the legal challenges with hiring and meeting all the hiring challenges we're now facing. So David, welcome very much. Before I officially introduce you, I just want to make sure that the technology is working. Brian, do you see the LinkedIn feed yet?
It's still coming up on mine. JJ?
I do see it, Lou. You're live on LinkedIn.
Okay, good. Hi, everybody. So welcome to the Almost Daily Recruiting Show. We are now LinkedIn Live and we are Zoom Live. Let me say to our Zoom, we have two feeds here, just to explain the technology roughly. We have people on our Zoom meeting directly. I welcome you to this. When you ask questions in the chat area or the Q&A area, we see them instantly. If you're on LinkedIn Live, you're actually about 20 seconds behind everybody. So it might appear to be a bit of a delay, which is a bit awkward for us because we're not delayed. We're actually going live here. So that's a bit of a challenge here, but we'll handle. That's why we have Brian and JJ producing the show. So let me welcome you all to the LinkedIn Live show with David Goldstein. I want to give a quick story before I let David give his introduction. When I wrote my book, The Essential Guide for Hiring and Getting Hired, which was 6 or 7 years ago, someone said, hey, you got to reach out to David Goldstein to bless it. So I called David up. I said, David, I've got this idea. I'd like you to read this book. He said, I don't read books. Well, that's not what he actually said. He said, tell me a little bit about it before I decide to read it. And he said, when I told him what it was about, he said, it ain't going to fly. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I said, David, would I pay you to read it? And we kind of negotiated a low fee, but he did read it. And he came back and said, actually, it's not too bad. With that introduction, David, rather than getting to the specifics of performance-based hiring in the book, who are you, what do you do, and why would I consider you or why does the world consider you an expert in this field?
Well, thanks, Lou. It's a pleasure to be on with you today, in spite of that somewhat odd introduction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I apologize for that. It didn't come out the way I thought.
I don't recall being that resistant, and I do recall being a little more enthusiastic about what you do, both before and after reading the book. And we'll talk more about that today. But I am a labor and employment lawyer at Littler Mendelson in our Minneapolis office. We are the world's largest labor and employment law firm, representing only management side. And for over 30 years now, I've been representing employers in all labor and employment related contexts. But a big part of my practice is counseling regarding hiring practices, regarding avoiding problems. When employers do end up in problems or in litigation, I represent them before the Fair Employment Practice agencies and in lawsuits. I've tried cases to judges and juries. And at this point, I co-chair the firm's OFCCP practice group, the group that focuses on government contracting. And most of my work at this point in my career relates to providing guidance to government contractors and helping them work with OFCCP. But that's really relevant for all contractors because OFCCP enforces basically Title VII standards, and they're aggressive about it. And if you can satisfy OFCCP, you can satisfy the EEOC and avoid problems with plaintiffs' lawyers too. So it creates a lot of opportunities to talk about best and worst practices and avoiding problems.
What would you say, David, just with that, as some of the big highlights of problems that you see on a regular basis in hiring, just the highlight level? And we'll get into some of the details though in a minute, but highlights.
Over time, the issue has always been just figuring out, how to do it. You've got, managers, hiring managers who want and need certain things. You've got HR and in-house legal that's trying to impose certain standards. And you've got recruiters that are trying to make their numbers and fill the positions. And everybody's interests are aligned, but not precisely. And if you're not careful about it, you sometimes end up with people working at cross purposes and making, both bad hiring decisions, which are frankly the biggest risk because you can't run your business if you're not hiring the right people, but also leading to liabilities, potential claims of discrimination and lawsuits. But I would just add to that at this moment in time, we are seeing a huge interest in all employers, almost all employers, regardless of size, in diversity. The events of this summer have really cast a light on issues of racism and systemic bias against Blacks. And there is suddenly a great, and I hope sustained interest in doing better. And that, though, is leading to lots of questions about how do we do better. And I think that's going to be a good part of our conversation today. But that's really the issue of the moment.
Okay, well, it sounds important though. So let me kind of go back 7 years, but it's also 30, 40 years and as important as today. When I first became a recruiter, my background was in manufacturing, engineering, finance, and accounting. So when I first took my first assignment, I just asked the hiring manager, it was a job description, had a bunch of skills on it. And I said, Mike, hey, this is not a job description. This is a person description. What do you want the person to do? And it was kind of off the cuff, but it made sense to me. And it was turning around a manufacturing plant making automotive components. And we just walked through the plant. We came up with 5 or 6 objectives a person needed to accomplish. And they were real performance objectives: turn around the manufacturing facility, upgrade labor performance, warehousing, a whole bit. Over the years, I created a business process that's really just a business process, just like manufacturing. Hey, you start with 10 candidates and you get 1 hire. And that ultimately became performance-based hiring. But the idea, and I want to give a quick 1-minute overview, and then I'm going to ask you, David, what's your general take on it? Because this was really the substance of the book. I basically said, if you want to hire a great person, you have to have a great job. And a great job is not a laundry list of skills and experience and competencies. It's a statement of work of what the person needs to do to be successful and why that's a good move for the candidate to get them excited about the work. And every job, it turned out, could be 5 or 6 key performance objectives, KPOs, or the same alternate term for it is OKRs, objectives and key results. That's the essence of the job description. From a marketing standpoint, we go out and look for candidates who would not only see that job as competent to do that work, but also see the job as a career move. In the interviewing process, we basically dig deep into their accomplishments. Hey, here's what we need done. What have you done similar to that? Walk me through your steps on how you got from A to B, accomplish that objective. We also, as part of that, we also look for the career growth opportunity. Is it exactly the same work that the person has done before? I see my camera just went out, so I don't have any clue why, but I'll ask David the question and I'll try to restart my camera. Then after we interview candidates, think the person's competent, we then say, hey, take this job because it's a career move because of what you're going to be doing, not what you get on the start date. And then we got to onboard based on the performance objectives. We got to deliver on the promise. That's what I consider to be a win-win hiring process. The win-win is we hire for the anniversary date, not the start date. And I think there's just too much focus on getting a job filled with a person skilled and experienced, but post-hire, it's all random luck. So our focus is let's look at least the first year, from the day you open the rec to the first year. So that's the essence of the book. David, what's your take on that concept, just from a practical standpoint as well as a legal standpoint?
No, I think it is a great approach to the process and one that, from everything I've heard from others, works well for people. From a legal perspective, it is entirely consistent with the legal principles that apply to employers, which basically are: don't discriminate, don't take protected class categories into account, have a process that is not obviously biased and doesn't correlate to protected class categories, and have a process that you can document and ideally is as objective as possible. And the the process that you outline really hits all the boxes.
What would you say about the first part? And I think this is one, and feel free if you're on the Zoom meeting in the chat area or the Q&A area, JJ and Brian are monitoring those as well as the LinkedIn Live meeting. Are there any questions coming in? Start asking them now, and let's make sure that they're relevant to the topic, but you don't have to, you asking the questions, they don't have to be specifically relevant. We'll get to those when they become relevant. But I want to make sure that we do have questions coming in the Zoom meeting as well as the LinkedIn Live meeting. David, let me go to one specific one, because I make the contention that most job descriptions list skills, experience, and generic competencies. Must fit the culture, must have 5 years experience, must go to this, I've gone to this school, must have 10 years experience and these kinds of skills. In my mind, that in and of itself is discriminatory because most of it's hard to define and most of it's subjective information, even though it looks objective. 5 years, I have this, I have cultural fit. To me, that is in this whole process, the fundamental missing link. Where am I wrong, or what's your take on that whole concept?
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that it's definitely discriminatory to look at any of those things. It doesn't have to be, but you are right that it opens the door to potential discrimination or potential biases. When you talk about a good fit with the corporate culture, different companies may mean different things by that. But you would want to know, what do we mean by that? And, is there something biased in that? The old the old time vision of maybe from a Mad Men era firm with a lot of hard drinking white men running the business, with certain ideas about who can work with them and what different people's roles are. That's a problem. And if that's your culture and looking for a fit into that culture, that is discriminatory, and it's also going to screen out excellent candidates. If by your culture you mean we value diversity and mutual respect, and we're looking for resilient people and people who can speak their mind but still be respectful of others, that's a culture that I would say is very inclusive and promotes diversity. You still may have some issues with subjectivity in deciding who fits that culture, but what you mean by your culture makes a big difference. Likewise, with X years of experience or particular degrees, they may make sense in some contexts. When Littler's hiring lawyers, a law school education is a really helpful thing for someone to have, and for them to be licensed in the state where they want to practice matters. So I wouldn't say that's always inappropriate, but there may be jobs involving some skills where, by focusing on the wrong thing, maybe you're screening out veterans who have acquired those skills in the military, but they talk about them in a different way, or they applied them in a different way. Or maybe you're screening out people from other industries. So all of the issues that you've mentioned are potential problems that need to be looked at as you're deciding how to write your job descriptions and your postings.
One thing I see, and when I see generic competencies come out, has to have good communication skills, which is clearly one that can cause a problem because it's very subjective of what's good. So I always ask the hiring manager, I know you want good communication skills. I always say, how is that used on the job? How is it used on the job? And typically it's used, the person has to work in a cross-functional team with engineering, manufacturing, accounting, and marketing. So I then say, if I can find people who have done that, would you at least see the person? So it's always to take this generic competency and create some kind of performance objective that's measurable. And to me, it's going from what a person has to what it looks like on the job. So what's your take on taking those generic ones that add a lot of subjectivity and creating some kind of performance measurement out of it that's at least measurable from the hiring manager perspective?
You're going to do better hires if you engage in that process and you take those generic types of requirements and fit them to the job in a way that you can actually assess them in the hiring process. So I agree with you. The one caveat I would add is that while employers want the primary focus to be on hiring the right candidate, getting the right person, they do have to worry to some extent about compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, with making sure that they have a process that makes it easy to identify who's a candidate who has qualifications and would be considered if we're looking at the employment data, calculating adverse impact, for example, and who's not. And in order to do that, you may want to focus on either, basic qualifications is the term of art from OFCCP world. Essential qualifications would be the term of art from the ADA world. But there may be some advantage to talking about certain broad categories and having them in there, so that you can say if somebody can't communicate well, they're not a candidate for this job. Or we didn't have to reasonably accommodate them under the ADA because the ability to communicate well is an essential function of this job. You may want to call that out, but you can call that out and still dig in deeper and measure it differently and present it differently in the job posting.
In terms, any questions coming in, Brian? I don't see any on the Zoom. I think we're starting to. No, we're not seeing. Or maybe we are. Any on the LinkedIn side, Brian, of questions coming in?
A couple of questions. One has to do simply with everybody is thinking about diversity now because of the current circumstances, and they're kind of scrambling to go, okay, how are we doing? And one of the questions is, so how do you actually set reasonable goals? How do those get set? How are those measured?
Yep, that's a great question. And we do see a lot of employers that, for example, are just saying, we want to be 50% women at these levels of the company because it's, population's roughly 50% male, 50% female, or we want to see X percent minorities or specific minority groups, and often plugging out numbers that are aggressive and aspirational. And that's a problem. Because A, you can't hire people who aren't out there, and B, the law does prohibit discrimination, even if that's discrimination in favor of a traditionally discriminated against class. So what we would recommend is to determine what your goals should be. You need to look at labor market statistics, and there's various ways to do that. The simplest and cheapest is to look at census data. You can figure out the areas that you can reasonably expect to hire from geographically, and you can find census job codes that indicate people who are currently working, who have the types of skills that you need, and look at the representation of women and either minorities or specific subgroups of minorities like Hispanics or African Americans, and see what the population is out there. And if you're looking for a certain type of engineering job, for example, and you're seeing that only 10% of the individuals employed in that job are African American, it's not going to make a lot of sense to have a short-term goal of 30% African American hires. But you could also look at who's in the pipeline in colleges and or technical schools, and you could think about things that you could do to help grow that pipeline over time. And that's what ultimately makes the most difference. But traditionally, it's been hard to get employers to focus on those types of longer term projects.
Right. So let me ask you this question. It just came up yesterday. Well, I have one client that we're working with is looking for a VP level spot. And the president said, I only want a woman of color in this role. All I want. He said, I'm not paying you a fee. And that wasn't me, but it was he said, I'm not paying you a fee. That's what I want. Is that appropriate? Or it might not be illegal, but what's your take on just that concept? And I quite agreed with him. I said, I agree with you. I can understand where you're coming from. He wanted to build a more diverse workforce.
Under the law, as it's currently interpreted, and as the courts are likely to interpret it going forward, given several years now of appointing judges that are more conservative on these issues, I would say that there's a very good argument that that approach is unlawful. But interestingly enough, I think one could also make an argument that it's not inappropriate.
That's-
And this is a decision that we see senior management making all the time. As lawyers, as HR professionals, it's our job to make sure that the C-suite understands what the law is and what the implications are of their decisions, but they then get to make the business decision. And I've had more than one CEO of a large company, a sophisticated person, say, if I have to read about my company being sued for reverse discrimination in the paper tomorrow morning, I'll deal with that. But this is what I think is important. This is what I think the company needs. And I'm going to do it this way. And, that's a reasonable business decision for someone to make as long as they're fully informed on the issues.
Okay, so here's, Brian, anything else there? I know
Well,
I see.
There's kind of a follow-up question, which is the legality of having a quota, in quotes, air quotes, on your team to promote diversity. For example, an all-male team wanting to onboard 20% women.
So a quota is unlawful. A hiring preference is unlawful. Hiring someone because they're a woman or because they're a particular racial or ethnic group, is just unlawful. Title VII prohibits it. State laws prohibit it. If you have admitted and been found to have discriminated in the past, there may be an exception for that, but that's not an exception that anyone's looking for. So you can't do it that blatantly, but valuing diversity, understanding the need to have diversity is important, and certainly engaging in outreach and trying to assemble applicant pools in a way to make sure that you are seeing well-qualified people from whatever group you feel you're underrepresented in is completely appropriate. And presumably, if you're getting those folks into your applicant pools, you're going to be hiring some of those folks because they deserve to be hired and they're the best candidate. I would also say that, it is rare to see two candidates who are truly, where someone is clearly better qualified than another. Qualifications are complicated, and as objective as you try to be, there's going to be ranges of subjectivity. And if you see a candidate who is a woman or an African American or a Hispanic or whatever diverse group you're looking at, in my experience, it is rare that you would have to say, I'm going to hire this person because they're a woman or because they're this particular race or ethnicity. There's usually other good reasons to hire that person. And it's nice that they're also adding to your diversity. But I think you can be, savvy as to your approach about this, which both limits your risk of liability and is frankly more respectful of your candidates, because you don't want anyone being hired or thinking they were hired because of their sex or their race. And you don't want their coworkers thinking that's why they were hired. You want people understanding that your hires represent good quality people who are going to do the job for you.
Okay, so this came up yesterday. Brian and I were on a call with a big company. We were talking to diversity leaders, and we have a scorecard on how we measure. And they said, well, how would you use your scorecard to improve diversity hiring? And I said, and it was almost paraphrasing what you said, David. I said, we know what performance qualified means. Here's your objectives. We found people who have met this criteria. Is it a perfect science? No, but we're roughly in the game that they're performance qualified. So you got a pool of 3 or 4 people who are all performance qualified. Then the decision is what I was saying, and Brian and I were saying, then you decide, hey, here's the candidates. Does having a diverse candidate add some other richness and strategic richness to the company over and above being able to do that work? And we said, that's probably the best way to make that decision, because you can't be at 100% perfect. They're pretty close performance qualified. If somebody of 3.5 and if one's a 3.3, that's kind of you can't get that precise on it. So the concept was, once they meet the performance qualified standard, then you say, is it important to have someone, a diverse candidate, to take that role and make it a separate criteria? So you have a 2-step assessment process. What's your take on that concept and the legality of it and the practicality of it? Maybe I don't think all 3 are possible, but
for a private sector employer that has to deal with Title VII only or state laws only, and doesn't have to deal with constitutional standards that public universities, for example, would have to deal with, or police departments or the like. I think that is a defensible position. I think it may even be correct under Title VII as it's been interpreted. Whether Title VII will continue to be interpreted that way and permit even that kind of limited consideration is very unclear. We've seen from some of the U.S. Supreme Court justices in the past hostility to any kind of consideration of protected class status. Supreme Court Justice Scalia, for example, wrote about that in the Ricci case. I think there are judges out there who would say it's a violation of Title VII to do what you just described, but that's not the law as it stands right now. And it would be a defensible position to take. And, again, as we said, I think, beyond the legalities, I think it might be a very appropriate and responsible position to take.
What is Title VII? I mean, I know you've mentioned it. Can you give us the quick take on it?
Sure. Title VII is the primary federal law that bars discrimination by employers, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and race, among other things.
Okay. So looking at this mission statement, we call it diversity hiring by design. It's win-win hiring. Develop a hiring process that opens a pool to everyone who's qualified, regardless of race, gender, orientation, all those issues. In your mind, is that a fair, just on the surface, a fair, appropriate goal, or is it violate some Title VII, or what's your take on that?
100% legal, 100% appropriate.
Okay, and our focus is that if they can do the work, and this is what's hard to get a hiring manager to agree to it. Hiring managers have in their mindset the person has to have 10 years experience, this degree from this school, this level of background, and if they don't have it, they're not even in the game. Our focus is to overcome it is, hey, what does a person need to do the work? If they do the work, it doesn't matter all these other stuff. I don't care if they're from Mars or Jupiter. If they can do the work, they deserve the job. And I actually say not only do the work, but motivated to do the work. And that's a little different. When I talk about motivation to do the work, I look for examples of where the person's in the last year or two highly motivated to do that work. Being competent to do the work isn't the same as motivated to do the work. And I put those two together. It's both competency and motivation measured by recently doing that work. And that's how I defend my program. I said why I think candidate A is better than candidate B. Both of them qualified, competent, but candidate B is highly motivated to do that work and it still wants to do it. What's your take on that concept of competent and motivated to do the work?
Again, it makes complete sense. It's what you would want in a new hire. The question is going to be, how do you determine that in the application process? And if you can defend your process of making a determination as to those qualifications, that's a wonderful way to approach it.
Okay, sounds good to me. Brian, we got some other questions. What do you see coming through?
Well, one question, and this is actually a conversation that you and I had the other day, is the legality of requiring your recruiters to have a diverse candidate pool. And one of our clients basically said, it used to be I wanted 50-50 or I wanted 40%, but now I want 2/3 to be diverse candidates, 1/3 to be non-diverse candidates. What are the implications of making a decision like that in the hiring process?
So you're getting closer to the line at that point. Again, the law is you can't discriminate against people, and that includes discriminating against white people or men, which are usually the folks who aren't being included in these pools. So the question is, what kind of impact is this policy having on well-qualified or maybe even better qualified non-diverse candidates? And if you are unreasonably screening out better qualified candidates in order to have clearly less qualified diverse candidates, that's a potential problem. If you're using this as a matter of discipline to make sure that you have a group of comparably qualified individuals that are diverse, this could be okay. But it's again, what are you sacrificing in order to have the diverse candidates reflected on the slate? And that relates to how do you instruct your recruiters and how do you train them and how do you reward them? Because certainly if you are implementing this by saying you either do this or you're fired, or if you do this, you make more money, you're going to be incentivizing people as individuals to perhaps make discriminatory decisions. And both the results of that decision making and the evidence of the process that you as the employer created could both be used against you in litigation or in the context of a charge.
Okay, so let me kind of describe this to you, taking what Brian just said there, David. As a recruiter, most of the people they don't just naturally apply to a posting. Frequently, we go on LinkedIn or some site and we look for names of candidates who look good for this job. And we reach out to those people. It could be we get referrals of diverse candidates. Hey, who's the best woman you know doing this kind of logistics position? But it's very proactive. So on this one search that I did the other day, I just went on LinkedIn Recruiter and I only looked for women who could do this work. I proactively looked at, and those are the only people I contacted. It was in my own mind, I wanted to do that. And it wasn't necessarily instructed to do it, but that's the way a lot of recruiters do it. They just go on, they proactively look for candidates, and then they try to reach out to those candidates and get them engaged in a conversation. So it's very much a targeted outreach program. It's not applying in, it's reaching out. What's your take on that? It's probably similar to what you just said, but slight distinction.
So first of all, are you doing this in the context of looking to fill a specific job, or are you trying to just create a pool of candidates for later jobs? How are you doing this?
It could be both. Well, let's assume in the case that I did it, it would have been proactively for a specific job. Okay. But in my early days, I was looking for accountants. I would build a pool of diverse accountants. I think the model would be either way or both of them.
So my general assumption is that jobs that are open and that you're looking to fill have been publicly posted. They're on a career website. They've been put on job boards, whatever. They're there for the public to see that they're open and for people to raise their hand and say, I want to be considered for that. If that's the case, you have a tremendous amount of protection. You can, if having publicly posted the job, you can do whatever you want to try to engage in outreach and recruitment activities and try to find diverse candidates to apply for that job. And as long as those folks are going to then be considered as part of the overall hiring process with the pool of everyone else who applied, your recruiting and outreach activities are completely safe. There is nothing unlawful about trying to reach out to diverse groups and trying to get them interested in your positions.
What if the job wasn't posted?
There's an open job and you have not posted it, right, and you're looking to fill it through this kind of recruiting. First of all, if you're a federal contractor, you're violating some of the rules that apply to you, but we'll put that to one side because your audience isn't just federal contractors. You're putting yourself then at much more risk because now you are discriminating. You're not giving the non-diverse group an opportunity to even be considered for the job. Now, how much of an exposure do you have? It may be limited because now people don't know that you're hiring for this job. Unless there's an internal candidate who saw what happened, or unless somebody knows somebody, your exposure is probably not great as a practical matter, but I would say what you're doing is neither a best practice nor lawful. And I would add to that no matter how much you care about diversity, you still want to hire the best person for your organization. And if you're shutting the process off to white men who may be well qualified, maybe very well qualified, you are hurting yourself and your organization. You don't want to go too far the other way, and I think you can accomplish your diversity goals without going too far the other way.
See, but I think this is where we had a conversation last week on our leadership council, which is the other event you're going to be on later in the month, where we had a couple diverse candidates there, and they say, no, having a diverse mindset in the organization is a strategic and business objective. And a white person doesn't have that perspective in this role. If it's an outreach job, marketing, understanding the customer base. And they clearly said that, and this was Black people who made that contention. It was, and I said, that's kind of an interesting viewpoint. What's your take on that? Where, hey, a diverse candidate is a better candidate.
That may well be the case in some contexts, but that possibility doesn't justify barring white candidates from applying for the job and making the argument why they would be better. And
Okay.
maybe you have a white candidate who grew up in a primarily African American neighborhood. Maybe one of their parents is African American, but they identify as white. Maybe they have all kinds of experiences that would fill the role. Do I think that's likely? No, but I think it's hard to defend having made the decision as management, we're not going to allow that type of person to raise their hand and present their credentials to us. I think that's very hard to justify.
Interesting viewpoint. Brian, anything else coming in, or JJ? I have a few, if not, so I'll just let you guys hold on.
Well,
Here's one that we had in a conversation we had recently. One company said, everybody we talk to, we can only talk to people where we have an open job. I said, why? I can talk to people. I'm saying, hey, we're thinking of hiring a couple of people in the marketing department, or a couple of engineers. If one of those spots made good career sense to you, would you be open to chat? So it was just, and it wasn't necessarily related to diversity. It was related to their corporate lawyer said, you can't talk to anybody in a casual conversation. I said, well, I'm going to be talking with David next week, and I'll ask him that question. So what's your take on that?
Okay, that's just rubbish. You can talk to anybody you want. You can talk to them about possibilities of jobs. And this is what recruiters do. I mean, it's a part, I don't know how you could tie a recruiter's hands like that. You want to have pipelines out there of potential candidates so that when you have an opening, you've got people to call and encourage to apply. Beyond that, you want to know who's out there and available. And I'll go beyond that. If you're having a conversation with someone who's maybe a superstar in their field, and they meet a diversity goal of yours, and you don't have a job opening for them, make a job opening for them and hire them. I'm not saying you should do that often. That should not be your regular practice, but that happens all the time. I mean, think of large, prestigious healthcare systems, for example. They may not have a job opening for a heart surgeon, but if one of the premier heart surgeons in the country indicates an interest in joining their faculty or their department, they're going to talk to that person and hire them if they can. And that's true in any number of areas. So yes, your regular practice should be, don't fill jobs unless you have a requisition, post it, have a formal process, and go by your rules. But in running a business, you need to take advantage of certain opportunities when they arise, and you can do so. And that's lawful and defensible.
So let me, on that same topic, why do so many corporate lawyers go to the extreme? And this is not, I mean, this was a real extreme one. And Brian and I just couldn't believe that they said it. I said, let me talk to your corporate lawyer, then I'll introduce you to David. But why do these corporate lawyers be so conservative with respect to what they allow their recruiters to do? They seem to be afraid of being sued. So what's your take on that whole concept of over conservatism?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. First of all, lawyers are by training and probably by nature fairly conservative. And that's a good thing. You really don't want a cowboy as your lawyer. You want someone who's going to be willing to put on the brakes and tell you what the downside risks are. So that's one. Two, I'm not sure what this particular lawyer's background was, but we all have our areas of expertise, and we're very good in those areas. And we get a little shakier when we move on to other areas of expertise, particularly as the law gets more complicated. So it's possible that the lawyer was working on an honest misapprehension of what the law required, and just didn't correctly understand it. The third reason, and perhaps the most valid reason for this kind of position, is as lawyers, we're experienced with working with clients, and the extent to which they will follow advice or try to avoid the advice that they're given. And it's possible that this lawyer knew his or her client and had some concerns about giving them much rope for fear of what they would do with it. So those are some of the reasons you may get a very conservative view from a lawyer compared to what maybe the law really requires.
Okay, Brian, I know there's a couple of questions. One is very long. I can't
Yeah.
read that one.
We do have a couple of questions in chat. So, what are the legal ramifications for having diversity recruiters, meaning recruiters whose only job is to look for diverse candidates?
As long as they're doing as long as their function involves getting more people into your pipeline and applying for your jobs and being considered as part of that whole pool, there are no negative legal ramifications to doing that. Perfectly appropriate, like anything else that you may have in a diversity, equity, and inclusion, function. You can have dedicated people designed to help meet these goals. So that's great. It would be a problem though if you gave certain job openings to those diversity recruiters and said, you're going to fill the job and we're only going to consider your diverse candidates for that job. That would be a problem.
And a follow-up to that is one company makes the distinction that it's okay to pay attention to race and gender when you're creating that candidate pool that you mentioned. But once the interview process starts at that point, they say that you should stop paying attention to those details. Is that approach appropriate, and is it lawful?
I would say that's a reasonable approach. The devil's always in the details. I mean, what do they mean when they say they're paying attention to race or gender and defining the pools? But if that means they're engaging in outreach, trying to attract diverse candidates, and then making sure some of those diverse candidates get considered at the next stage, that's perfectly legitimate and lawful. It certainly would be a best practice not to be considering race or sex when making the actual decision. So at the interview stage or beyond. But again, as we've discussed, as a practical matter, some employers may choose to consider that at that stage. I wouldn't say that's clearly lawful, although, as I said, there's an argument that it may be for private employers. But as a practical matter, that may be worth the risk to them.
Yeah. Let me ask a question. This has more than just diversity, but it's one that we get frequently, and I think most people would agree that posting jobs is not necessarily the best way to find people. And when you look at the statistics, and I've looked at some from applicant tracking systems, 300 million applications, only 300 million, only 3 million actually got hired. And about 7 million got interviewed, which is only 1% get hired, about 4 to 5% get interviewed, because a lot of non-qualified people apply. So I make the general statement is that why don't you send everybody who applies and say an email says, hey, David, thank you for applying. One of the key steps in our process is writing a quick 1 paragraph or 2 paragraph summary of accomplishment related to this is to the real needs of the job, which is such and such. Please respond, and then we'll seriously consider your part of our application process. I call that the 2-step. Is you send an email back to everybody who applies and says, our process is, the next step in our process is you summarize a major accomplishment related to a real job need. What's your take on that 2-step process? Because it quickly eliminates 97% of the people who shouldn't have applied to begin with.
I love that. And I will say, my oldest son is an engineer who's currently looking for employment after his job was eliminated due to COVID. And, he's having the experience that you described. He applies to a lot of jobs and they're getting, however many hundreds or thousands of applicants, and they're making, they're deciding who to move forward based on whatever criteria it is. Some of it may be networking or other things. And they're maybe missing out on very well qualified candidates. So I think your process gives you a way to measure everybody in a realistic way, and really ought to work to improve the quality of the applicants that you ultimately look at. So, again, lawful, and to me makes a lot of sense.
Well, let me do this for your son and for everyone else who's listening who has a son or is looking for a job. if you go to this website, and I think it's here somewhere, but I don't know exactly where it is, winwinhiring.com. You might go www.winwinhiring.com. You'll see a free course, which is it's for candidates on how to prep for a job. And it basically says is once you get the interview, here's how to make sure you're interviewed accurately. And basically, and this is not necessarily the legal advice, but you might want to send it to your son and he can put a review in there. Basically says and I think this is actually important, it's to ensure you're not interviewed or you're interviewed without biases. Just ask the interviewer, hey, David, can you tell me a little bit about the job before we get too far into the details? I'd like to give you some examples of work that I've done that's most related. I call that a forced choice question, but it's forcing the interviewer to describe the work that needs to be done and then giving an example of that work. It really just asking a question puts you in the top half, answering it properly puts you in the top quartile. So it's just a real cool step. www.winwinhiring.com. I think your son will like it, and anybody who's looking for a job should take that advice as well. Brian, any other questions coming in? There's one here that Chelsea asked that it's pretty long, but it seems pretty important to me.
No, it's a very important question, and it is at the heart of the matter on the other side. So this is kind of a scenario, David. You're a TA leader. You've got a candidate that's been presented who is highly qualified, performance qualified for the job, happens to be a white male. The feedback after the interview from the executives are good candidate, but they want a diverse hire. We're going to wait for a diverse candidate. What type of feedback should a good talent acquisition leader give to that management team with respect to that scenario?
That is an interesting question.
We stumped David the first time.
No, not stumped. I'm just thinking about all the additional questions I want to ask. I mean, there's a lot of context there. You'd want to know more about that management team. You'd want to know more about the process and where you are. If this is a highly specialized position and the recruiter has been working for a year to find a well-qualified candidate, and having done that gets this response, I'd say that's a problem from a business standpoint as well as a diversity standpoint. And I think you need to have a discussion about that. If this is a posted job and it was open for 30 days and they went through their standard process, and this is where they are in the process, but there's reason to believe that there may be equally qualified diverse candidates out there, I think that's an appropriate message from management back to the recruiter, that you did not do your job as well as you should have done. We mean it when we say we want diverse slates. Go back and give us one. Doesn't mean we won't hire the white guy at the end, but you didn't do your job on it. So this could be either of those situations depending on the facts, and you'd want to treat it appropriately.
Yeah.
What if you kind of took that same thing and told the candidate, at least plan one is, hey, we definitely like your background. You're definitely a finalist, but we're responsible to get a few other candidates the board wants to meet. That would be what I would tell the talent leader to at least say to it. True or not, I'd say that's at least a way to do it. More importantly, though, I would go back to the original or a comment made earlier is that what's the value of a diverse candidate? And I would ask the board is, okay, why do you want a diverse candidate? Is it just meet a quota, or is there some business reason for that diverse candidate? Which goes back to, no, we're building we want to map to our audience or our customer audience, and therefore we need that visibility, and that's a performance requirement. Then if the white male can meet that performance requirement, he is perfectly qualified for it. But and I think to create a performance objective around that need for diversity as well as a feeling or a must-have. What's your take on that approach?
No, I think all of that is fair. I think part of the dialogue you're describing depends a lot on how the employer's talent acquisition function is arranged. I mean, that sounds like an appropriate conversation, perhaps, with the head of TA. I would be a little more hesitant to see, individual recruiters on the front line, requiring that kind of defense of a hiring criteria from the hiring managers. Partly because I just think that's a very sensitive topic and one that might not necessarily want to discuss through all levels of the organization that way. But depending on who your recruiters are, how well they're trained, their level of discretion and responsibility, that might be an appropriate conversation.
Well, we're almost wrapping this up, so I want to ask just a few questions, and maybe Brian or Jed, you have one more question. Where do you see the most problems with respect to legal and the compliance side? If you just had to say, these are things that people should avoid or really take a hard look at, where would you say they come out?
In all honesty, this is the flip side of diversity hiring. Too often, I see employers that have really stretched to hire a person because they're diverse and not because they're a good fit for the job. And that's just a recipe for disaster. They may not perform well in the job. It may result in turnover. You may end up with discrimination claims resulting in discipline or termination of that individual. You may poison the well for other diverse candidates who are considering your organization because all they know is that the diverse candidates you've hired in the past have not worked out well. There's just a lot of problems that come from lowering appropriate standards just to promote diversity. I think the goal needs to be increase diversity by hiring well-qualified people. If those folks aren't out there, look at ways to train and mentor, maybe intervene in high schools or technical schools or colleges, increase the pipeline. But ultimately, you need people who have the skills and experiences to do the job appropriately and who can command the respect of their peers and subordinates and managers.
Yeah, I think you said something that's really profound when this came up in a number of cases is you can hire diverse candidates, but making sure they're both satisfied, they perform. The post-hire process is just as critical as the pre-hire process. And if you don't map those two things, you're going to get in trouble. So I think, David, that to me was as important as anything you've just said here. Any one last question, Brian, and then we can wrap it up? I like to end these before the top of the hour. Don't feel obligated to do it. If there's one there that you feel, JJ, one there that you think stands out?
I have a random question. I'm not sure it's within the scope of this, but
I've got one that I still want to ask.
Great.
I want to ask
Great.
something. David, it seems like at the micro level, it's when hiring managers make the decision, they tend to overvalue someone whom they know. When they hire a stranger, they tend to they're conservative, just like lawyers. I don't know this person, so they have to have these kinds of skills. And it's kind of the lawyer. I don't know the law, so I'm going to be extra conservative. But then when they hire a diverse candidate, it even adds dimension of risk. Okay, this person's a white person like me. They have the right skills. I'm going to hire that person. Diverse candidate is even more risky for the hiring manager. Is there any advice you'd give to TA leaders or the hiring manager at that moment of saying yes or no to make that decision? And I think it goes back to when you said about the lawyers. When you don't know the law, you tend to take an extreme conservative position. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, those, I know this is an issue you've talked about it at length in your books. It's a real inherent problem with human nature that, we're more comfortable with people who have backgrounds that are similar to us. They're easier to talk with. We're more likely to see them as competent or fit for the job. Particularly in the relatively superficial context of reading a resume or having a half an hour interview. And it is a problem that you have to fight against by building methods into your hiring process to prevent it, by requiring people to focus on the right questions and the right qualifications. And I know you've got a number of tips about, dealing with first impressions and waiting to make the decision and how to score interviews. And these are all important techniques to help us avoid both implicit and explicit biases and just human nature. I mean, I'll tell you the worst hire I ever made personally was I'm a former New Yorker who lives in Minneapolis and had someone apply for a job who had a background very similar to mine. And we had a great half an hour chatting about things that didn't have a lot to do with the job. This is a long time ago, statutes of limitations long past. But, based on that connection, I made the hiring decision and it, she was a terrible hire who did not last. And, that's just no matter how trained you are, no matter how sophisticated you think you are, you fall into these traps. And it's very important for employers to provide their people with the tools and the training necessary to avoid those traps in the hiring process.
Yeah, so I would say, and just in summary, and you can kind of add a quick summary too, David, is use the interview to collect the evidence to make the hiring decision. Don't make the hiring decision during the interview. Now, that's easy to say, but hard to do. So therefore, we say you got to systematize it out of the process. The best way is to define the work that needs to be done, not the skills needed to do the work, and use a structured interview process to collect that evidence. That to me is the hiring process, but the post-hire process, the company has to support that hiring manager to make a risky decision, and the company has to support the hiring manager and provide and set a culture where you can actually ensure that your diverse candidates or any candidates are successful on the job. So I want to thank everybody. David, any last thoughts or comments on what they need to do? How would that people reach you? I know they can connect with you on LinkedIn. This was fascinating, David. I thank you very much. We have a white paper with all your contact information. What would be the best way to reach you though? Through LinkedIn, you think, or?
LinkedIn is fine. The Littler website, dgoldstein@littler.com. All of those ways, I'm happy to hear from people. These are important issues, and glad to make my contribution.
Great. Thank you very much, David. I thank you very much. I thank everybody for watching LinkedIn Live and the Almost Daily Recruiting Show. Hopefully that was helpful. See you next week or next month, but thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you all.